Availability is critical to the well-being of people. According to the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria, as at 2023, 28 million people or more were homeless. As Nigeria experiences housing deficit where housing units are in limited supply, some of the causes include lack of favorable government policies, high cost of construction materials, and high property cost, amongst others. Despite the government's effort to nip this anomaly and bridge the gap in housing deficit, the growing population, especially in urban areas, thwarts the government's effort as well as that of private-owned companies. Well, joining us in the studio is property consultant, principal partner, Supreme Eagle Solicitors, Oluwafemi Onokoya. Good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, when we talk about housing deficits, the government several times has said that it was working to bridge the gap. As of 2023, it is said that we have about 28 million housing deficit as of 2023. That's last year. For now, we cannot necessarily say what the numbers are, but you keep seeing the growing number of the population as it is. What really is at the heart of we not being able to bridge the gap?
Thank you very much for having me.
Right.
Okay, so one of the major challenges we are faced with in Nigeria is overpopulation. Right. Unfortunately, Nigeria is not a country that can have, unlike China, that have birth control mechanism, strict birth control mechanism. As the former head of state of this country, General Babangida, made an attempt to make policies for birth control, saying that you must not have more than 4 children. But unfortunately, that couldn't come to play. So where you see a family where they have 4 children, 5 children, 6 children, and at the end of the day, these children will eventually grow up. When they become of age, they will have their own children. Not even only that, 4 children would eventually have 4 shelter, 4 roofs over their head, and the list keeps expanding. I have a friend of mine, his mother had over 9 children. And all these 9 children will have to live in several houses. So how can there not be issue of housing deficit if we cannot control the population? And also the fact that rural-urban migration, where people migrate, people seek for greener pastures, they migrate to Lagos or to Abuja or to Port Harcourt, as the case may be. You see cases whereby people migrate, and as a result of this migration, there are a lot of issues when it comes to accommodation. I can tell you that most people in a real estate company, the moment they build a particular property, before completion of this property, you will see people rushing to pay. Yeah. Because they know that houses are not more, the demand is more than the supply. Even those that are building houses, you will see a lot of, I'm sure if you've come across flyers where you see off-site, off-plan sale. Before roofing the house, you see people making payments. So how can we address the issue of housing deficit when we have a population issue to address? Now, it's a good thing. Population can be to our advantage. China is taking advantage of its population. We are not saying that Nigeria should not be populated.
Because I was going to ask. So should we start asking people to have birth control, although that is encouraged, but then to start saying that we want to have a policy on child control and all. But go ahead.
So as I was saying, government needs to look inward in building more houses, in partnering with private sectors. For example, a case study of public servants. If the government can finance building a studio apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, a 3-bedroom apartment, as the case may be, for all public servants. So when you are going into an employment with the government, you are assured, you are guaranteed that you have a home. And because of the job security, it will be easy for the government to deduct from your salary. If you notice, an average Nigerian that had a humble beginning, before they could be able to afford a building, they must have crossed the 4th ladder. That is, they must be 40 and above. Some people, they will graduate at the age of 23, 24, 25. it will take them 1.5 decades, 2 decades. And that is the people that are a little above average. My firm happens to act as attorneys for property owners. And I can tell you that you see well over people that are 60 years old, still renting an apartment, some are even struggling to pay their rent. So government needs to look inward for the issue of public sector, get accommodation, build properties for them. And for those in the private sector, the government should also, we are quite aware of the NHF.
Yes.
We are quite aware there's another one, I'm not sure if that is very popular, MPHS, at the Ministerial Pilot Housing Scheme. So government should do more. This scheme, this NHF we are talking about, the question is how many people are aware of it? Is government doing sensitization? And the fraction of those who are even aware of it, do they have accessibility?
That's the question. Are they benefiting from it?
I know so many friends of mine that are telling me that their money is hooked. Because for those in the private sector, you're expected to pay 10% of whatever value of the property you intend to get. They give you stringent criteria that the property must have a C of O, that the property must be built up already. And if the properties are owned by businessmen, they won't wait for Federal Mortgage Bank to finance you before they sell the property.
And that is why some of these housing units that were built, currently we have some going
in
on
Lagos
by
State.
the Federal Housing Authority.
Yeah.
And some were built by the past administration. I saw in a particular state about 18,000 units that were built, but they were abandoned because many people could not, meet up with some of these criteria. But apart from the issue of overpopulation, I also want to, bring your attention to the fact that we have a sort of increase in pricing, overpricing of houses. If you look at Lagos State, especially from 2020 during the lockdown, comparing it to now, we have a sort of overpricing of houses. What do you think about that?
Well, will you blame a businessman who intends to make profit from his business?
Really? It's for profit making?
So most businessmen, take my word for it, most businessmen wants to make profit at the end of the day.
But why do market forces never influence the price of rent in most cases? I'll also turn your attention to our over-dependence on concrete and cement. But basically, yes, in Nigeria, you will notice that market forces, it's a particular price a landlord decides to give you, that he will give you, and you have no choice but to get the house if you can.
The demand is more than the supply. That's the very first thing. I mentioned earlier that even as some property, even before completion, people have already made payments. And then, unfortunately, Lagos State has tried. The Lagos Tenancy Law has made laws, and there is a regulation for pricing, but unfortunately, the landlords are not following it.
Very good.
They are not following it. And the fact that the market forces has affected building material. For example, cement last year was over 3,035. Is now in Lagos now is now about 7,000, between 7,500 and 8,005. So these are the things. If you ask a developer or a builder what is going through and what led to him increasing his prices, he will tell you when I'm buying iron rod, it's on. So even 12 mm is above 1 million naira. And as at that time, he was buying it at 435,000 naira. What will you say about all that? So they would look at it vis-a-vis the cost. And aside that, what most people also do is they look at the prevailing market rates, the prevailing rates. Renting a 2-bedroom in VI, the value, there is a prescribed value.
Who prescribed it?
No, the market. The market. For example, in Victoria Island, and I'm saying this from experience, for you to get a studio apartment, that is just a room and kitchen and toilet, in VI, in the heart of VI, you must not have anything less than 1.5 million naira. So they are rates. And if your rate is too high, and all these agents that market all these properties, they can as well take the clients to a cheaper apartment. So they are usually rates, not rates that
that are determined by markets in
Yes.
various locations.
Exactly.
So the rate in VI is different from the rate in K2 now,
Yes.
for instance.
Yes.
So for instance, in K2, how much would the studio apartment be for? It won't be up to 1.5. Is that what you're saying?
It depends on the area in K2. If it's close to the express, so there are so many indices.
Let's not also forget agency fees and agreements. There's also that.
There are so many indices you look at. If the house is close to the main road, there's a particular amount, maybe, and if it's a new house, because people consider whether the house is new or it's an old house. If it's a new house, probably maybe between 500 or thereabouts. If it's an old house, well, maybe 400, maybe 350, as the case may be. So there are rates, not prescribed to, but prevailing market rates.
Now, let's go back to the tenancy law that you mentioned earlier, why it's so difficult to implement, because you want to get an apartment and you're told you have to pay for 2 years. Meanwhile, the law states 1 year, it shouldn't be more than a year and all of that. And the agent is asking you for 2 years agency fee and all of it. Why is it so difficult to implement in Lagos, for instance?
Well, some tenants are desperate. Unfortunately, some tenants are desperate. And in most cases, the 2 years rent itself has come down a little bit. Before the advent of the tenancy law of 2019, you can have, the tenancy law of 2019 states that it must be a year. And most landlords, not all, most landlords are complying because the rate has dropped astronomically.
Okay.
It has dropped astronomically. But you still have some. But you can't compare it to before 2019 when people were paying 2 years rent. And unfortunately, tenants that are looking for shelter, they won't have the time to go and sue the government. I mean, to sue the landlord, to say, I want to get an apartment and he's asking for 2 years rent. I want to sue him for contravening.
So the desperacy of the tenant is what has made it impossible for most landlords to implement. Bottom line, that's what you're saying.
Yes.
Right. Interesting.
But if you look at Singapore, a place like Singapore, we have about 90% of the population, many of them own houses. And if you go there, you see stories and stories of buildings in that place. How possible is it? Because it sort of connotes a deliberate policy from the government to ensure that every individual there has a house. But how possible is it for it to, work in Lagos? Lagos is the smallest state in Nigeria. If we have those kind of buildings, we have a few of those buildings on the island. High-rise buildings on the island. But if we have that, will we be able to, mitigate some of the housing crisis?
Okay, so what government needs to do is to work in partnership with developers, with real estate companies, with investors that invest in real estate. I'll give you an example. During the last administration, the Lagos State administration, shortly before the end of the last Lagos State administration, I was privy to be involved in a transaction that involves a partnership with Lagos State. This client of mine brought a proposal to build over 2,000 units of apartments, of 2-bedroom, of 3-bedroom apartment, low cost housing estate. Unfortunately, because of the change in government, it wasn't implemented, but it got to the final stage. Unfortunately, it wasn't implemented. So when we have government drawing investors, building it up, government taking over, and give a prescribed rate. For example, if there are 20 units that is probably maybe partly funded by Lagos State. The equity could be land. The equity could be maybe 10% or 20%, as the case may be. The government can give a particular rate, that this is the going rate this house should go. But if the house is built by a private individual whose desire, whose goal is to maximize profit, and unfortunately the laws are not checkmating them, the property will keep on increasing.
Right. Now let's even talk about those who have managed to get property. And in recent times we saw Lagos State, for instance, demolishing some buildings, and because they did not get the right documentation and all of that, to understand that the lands where they built on were perhaps not lands meant to be built on. And not just Lagos State, we saw somewhere else, Southeast, where some people's buildings were also demolished. And then we started hearing people wailing, saying that there were those who were saying they were no longer going to invest in real estate and all of that. Talk to us about this matter of documentation for those who perhaps have the means of building, how they can get it right to avert and avoid such. Because a lot of people lost huge amounts of monies, 40 million upwards, like that.
First of all, I sympathize with those affected, families affected. My heart bleeds whenever I see this bulldozer bulldozing these buildings. And this is, I always tell my clients, it's always better not to be penny wise, pound foolish. I'll tell you recently, there's this client of mine who is based in the UK. He told me he needs to get a property that my firm should scout for properties for them and all that. At the end of the day, there was a particular one he saw for himself. He really liked the property. He wanted to buy. And when I asked one or two questions from the developer, I wasn't satisfied. And I knew that 5 years from this time, 10 years, 20 years, as the case may be, this property may be subject to demolition.
What were the things that you noticed?
For example, and many Nigerians don't know this, especially when you are buying property from a real estate developer. Now, I'm not saying they don't sell good properties. A quite number of them are trustworthy, honest, and integrity. But you have a lot of people that have flooded the system. They are not experts in that field. Unfortunately, whatever regulation, if at all there is not strong enough. Anybody that has money, that has capital, can just venture into it. And that particular, to your question, that particular property, I asked him, does it have a C of O? He said it's in the pipeline. Okay. Have they given you assessment fee? Because when you see a property and they tell you it has a file number, and that's the only thing it has, then there are chances that you may never even get to have a C of O. Because some of all these properties are built on a committed acquisition. In Lagos State, first thing a landowner or a prospective buyer needs to do is to engage a professional in that field to carry out what we call charting information. The charting information will give you the history of the land. For example, to build near to a canal, the setback is 15 meters. From the ocean is 30 meters. So all these things will be in the charting information. This charting information will tell you, because there's a master plan for Lagos State. There's a master plan. If a particular area has not been built for 50, 30, 40 years, a particular administration can wake up one day, and that's where you get to see a lot of people wailing and crying that they demolished their houses. Look at the case of Ikota. There are many narratives on the TV that the government is targeting a particular tribe, but that's not true. They built on a canal because government the part was earmarked for canal. But because government had not done anything, they did what they call reclamation. They sand-filled it, they built a lot of houses, and they sold to people. And these innocent buyers, some of them did not take out time. In as much as I sympathize with them, some of them did not take out time to engage a professional, to carry out due diligence on these properties. The first thing a lawyer is meant to do when he's being tasked with this responsibility is to get a survey. After charting the survey, then you then go with a surveyor to pick the coordinates. Because there are times that they play, some sellers play a lot of gimmicks. The coordinates in the survey plan may not be the same coordinates on the land. So for you to do a proper due diligence, you have to go there. You have to pick the coordinates, chart it on the master plan, and it will tell you if this land is free or not. But many people, and you see cases of people, because they are desperate, you see cases of people desperate to buy. And there's a thing some of all these people do. They call it distress sale. They'll sell it, they want to sell it at an undervalued price. So people will rush, for example, a property that is worth 100 million, they'll tell you to pay 45 million naira. So once I see transactions like that, I'm always very skeptical. And I try to dig deeper. And unfortunately, some people don't have the patience. At times when I tell my clients, give me a week, 2 weeks to carry out this due diligence, they will tell you they quickly want to pay. And at the end of the day, I do my recommendation. So what I do is that once I see a 50-50, I will advise my clients that this is a 50-50 transaction. Government can wake up one day to clear this place, and government can decide to ratify. But it's a 50, but I cannot back my horse on a 50-50 transaction. I mean, on a 50-50 chance, when I know that this is a property that will transcend to my children, to my children's children.
So you mentioned something about numbers. I can't remember what you called it, a number, but what does that even mean when you're talking about ratifying and checking all of the documentation? And then how easy is it for property owners or landowners to get this documentation? Because the processes have been one of the things that some persons say is quite cumbersome, and so they just want to jump at anything.
So it's a gradual process. First thing first, if you want to buy a property, the first thing is to know that the property is safe to buy. Then you can then go ahead with documentation. Lagos State has introduced E-C of O.
That was after this whole demolition was happening. And
before.
Of people were calling for, the neck of the state, for instance. Let me use that word, that how easy is it for them to get the documentation? That is there were bottlenecks. And so perhaps a lot of people got to know about this e-documentation that you are mentioning now. Most of the people who lost their properties, I'm sure, were not aware.
Okay. So part of the Land Use Act of 1974 vests the power to own houses, the governor of each particular state to have the land in their custody and hold it in trust for members. That's where the issue of certificate of occupancy comes to play. Before the Land Use Act of 1974, all we have is fee simple. You have a property in perpetuity. You are the owner, you are the omonile, you are the overlord. In fact, they call them overlords. But after the advent of the Land Use Act, we state that all lands are vested in the hands of the governor, and the governor holds it in trust for members of the state, and they give allocation. So what it means is that after the advent of this Land Use Act, you have to apply to the government to get your certificate of occupancy. So now, like I said earlier, if you want to buy a property, the first thing is to know that charting and all that, sometimes for the purpose of closing a transaction, all those can be done within 24, 48 hours. So after sale, and documentation is being carried out, then you can now begin the process. You have to obtain a form. You have to pay, you have to ensure that your tax, you paid your tax to the state where you bought the property. I mean, for the state where you bought the property, you have to ensure you pay your tax. You have to pay assessment fees for C of O, and then you have to wait for vetting and all that before the certificate of occupancy comes out. How
long does this take?
Well, every administration has its own challenges. Every government.
Just give us perhaps an overview of how long it takes.
If you are very lucky, I've seen some come out in 3 months.
3?
But it's very rare.
So we're looking at 6 months.
That's being lucky.
You see, that's the issue for most persons. They want something that they could address in about maybe in a week. Why is it taking so long?
So it's the bottlenecks. Bottlenecks. Because there's a lot of clearance.
Right.
You have to, for example, if your tax is not cleared,
Okay.
that can cause a delay. Your tax is not cleared. If you don't have approvals, you need to get, for a built-up property, you need to have approval. So it has to go through various agencies and before you get the approval.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to thank you now because we have to leave this conversation here. Our time is up. Property consultant, principal partner, Supreme Eagle Solicitors, Oluwafemi Onokoya, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right.